18 years ago, at 27 weeks pregnant, I became deathly ill, and my daughter Haley was born by emergency C-section at 1 pound, 13 ounces to save my life. At the same time, my family went through a crisis of faith when my parents' marriage dissolved, and our family was shattered in a public, humiliating way. Because of those emergencies, hidden fears surfaced, spiraled out of control, and I began experiencing panic attacks. Having those near-death experiences shook me. Even though I was ready to go to heaven, I feared going through another traumatizing physical experience. I feared the process of dying and how scary it would be. I feared my daughter dying or having long-term permanent brain damage or physical disability from her early birth. I feared not being able to take care of her. I was sad about my parents' marriage, and I feared what our friends thought about our once strong Christian family dissolving due to years of hidden sin. I started fearing that everyone I loved would die or leave me, and I'd be all alone. I repeatedly concluded that God wasn't good and that He didn't care about us, and those thoughts led to shame and guilt. Eventually, misery forced me to work on things. I learned that in the middle of my panic, I had two choices: continue to let my thinking spiral out of control, or take my honest questions to God and see how He was doing good amid situations that seemed so bad. As I read Trusting God by Jerry Bridges and Overcoming Fear, Worry, and Anxiety by Elise Fitzpatrick, I found that God wants me to be settled in His love, faithfulness, and sovereignty, even with my sometimes messy life. As I cried out to God, I experienced Him answering my prayers. As I honestly poured out my fears, I learned that He wasn't going to use them against me. As I noticed things for which to be thankful, I realized God wasn't a hoarder, keeping all the good stuff for Himself. In trust, I began to grow out of self-absorbed fear and simply love my family. Then I experienced the kind of self-sacrificial love Christ had loved me with, and I became less afraid that He was going to fail me. My faith was strengthened, and eventually our family expanded to include another daughter, Shelby. We love our little family.
I am my mother's daughter, so it isn't surprising that I struggle with fear and panic too. When I was 10 years old, I realized that the world wasn't as safe as I had assumed it was. My mind became consumed with lots of things to be afraid of. In the beginning, I feared that I might be kidnapped or hurt by someone. Because I feared that God wouldn't keep me safe, I started trusting myself to keep me safe, but I knew I couldn't. For the next 2 to 3 years, I occasionally mentioned my fears and sort of worked through them with my parents. But internally, it was getting worse. Big fears would take over my life in cycles, which I forced myself to manage without ever really working through them, just like my mom. Once, I choked while I was eating, and I realized that you could die from choking. So then, I became afraid of eating any food at all. Then I became afraid that I might hurt someone else. I feared that just by thinking something, I could make it come true. I started thinking some evil thoughts and became afraid that I could actually be that evil of a person. I was afraid of ever leaving my mom's side because she was my safe place. I never wanted to be by myself. As time went by, I never resolved my fears, and it got so bad that I started not being able to function at all, and suicide thoughts became a constant part of my life. That came to a head on New Year's Day of 2018 when I told my mom that I had no hope of making it through the year. That day, my mom and I were snuggling, and she was telling me all the exciting things she was looking forward to doing with our family. All I could think about was how miserable I was and how I had no hope of anything good happening.
We'd been working with Shelby through fear for several years, but that day we learned just how pervasive her panic had become. God had brought me through my fears, panic, and depression. Because of that, I understood and identified with Shelby's heart, and I knew how to help her. As a family, we helped her learn to be a warrior, fighting through her fears and worry. We prayed all the time, in the middle of anything we were doing, learning to cry out to God for help in real time. They were just like, God, rescue us, prayers. God, we're freaking out right now. We're so afraid. Please help us know what to do. When we identified a specific fear, we would cry out to God for help to deal with it. God, Shelby is so afraid of being kidnapped right now. Please calm her down and help us know how to keep her safe. God, Shelby can't eat because she's so afraid she'll choke. Please help her chew her food and swallow.
We studied what God said about my specific fears and then read from the Bible about how God says to handle them. I also spent a lot of time thinking about Philippians 4:8-9 and learned what's good to think about and dwell on. Then we did lots of practical things to help me with my obsessed thinking. We programmed our Alexa speakers to read me a Bible story when I felt panicky at bedtime, to play a specific music playlist and that calmed me and gave me good things to think about, to read me Matthew 5 when I was afraid, or Hebrews 12 when I needed to stop thinking about myself, or to quote a specific biblical truth when I lost control of my thinking.
I don't think Amazon ever imagined the godly ways we would use Alexa technology to help retrain Shelby's thinking. The most practical thing we did for Shelby was to be available to help her when she began to fear. Because if her thinking spiraled out of control, then she'd be locked in panic for hours. So that looked like a lot of middle of the night praying together, a lot of conversations during the day, and a lot of encouraging her to cry out to God instead of holding her fears inside. The most important thing we faced was Shelby's fear that she might actually be an evil person. We faced that by acknowledging that she truly was wicked. And given the freedom to act however she thought, she was capable of horrific, evil things. But that is what made her salvation so precious. God had loved her enough to make a way for her to be good through the death and resurrection of Jesus.
We look back on that scary year for our family with victory. Every time we cried out to God for help, He heard us. Every fear brought me closer to God and grew my faith. My confidence in Him is more secure, and now my first step when I'm afraid is to cry out to God for His help. Psalm 34 says, "I sought the Lord, and He answered me. He delivered me from all of my fears." Those who look to Him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in Him.